Hello everyone and welcome back to Boater Plays Something. We are reading Thera Awakening, the prequel novel to Stonekeep. When we last left off, our heroes, Wraith, Orvig, and Calandra, had just captured a Throg and are planning to interrogate her to find out where the Unemakar clan that has been sending the Seymara and slaughtered the villages of Gotmeg and Adra are, as well as finding Orvig's sister, Jen. So, let's dive into it. On Boater, let's read something. Thera Awakening by Steve Jackson and David Pulver. Chapter 6. You'll have to talk to her, Calandra said to Orvig. Find out where your Jen is, she said, and how we can reach her without getting caught. Wraith nodded. He was sitting on a tree stump, wiping the blood off his sword with a rag. And see if you can find out why the Throg started this, added Wraith. He looked at the blade. If we're killing them, I want to know why. I'll do my best, boy, Orvig said. He glanced at Kel. You stay over there, lass. She's too nervous to talk when you're too close. Orvig approached the captive warrior. His Throg speech was slow and halting. He punctuated his words with gestures, trying to make himself understood. Often he pointed at Kel, and once at Wraith. The Throg woman answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, darting furtive glances in Kel's direction. Did you find anything on the bodies? Wraith asked Calandra. Nothing much, Kel replied. She was sorting through a stack of leather helmets, cloaks, coarse tunics, and fur breeches they'd stripped from the dead. Some provisions. Won't touch their meat, but they had some black bread and dried fruit we can use. Kel paused. And one of the warriors you slew had this. She handed him a short sword. Wraith turned it over in his hands, noting the fine workmanship. This is dwarven steel, Wraith said, not Throg work. It was made in Stonekeep. He studied the inscription on the side. He nodded grimly. Last year's mark from the Alban Forge clan. It's not some heirloom. They got this off the Seth party. Orvig came over to them looking thoughtful. Well, he said, I found out a fair bit, though I had to promise that Kel here would eat her heart if she didn't tell me. Does she speak truth, do you think? Asked Kel. Orvig nodded. She's sure we're all magicers. I think she's too scared to lie. She told me her tribe, the Unemakar, has a stronghold a half-day's journey from here. They call it Karkulroth. Oh my god, I cannot with Orvig's accent. Karkulroth. Sure. The Sheltering Dark. That's where they took Jen. By the way, you were right, he said to Kel. She's being held in a dungeon in their stronghold. Their shaman's been questioning her about Stonekeep. Why? Said Wraith. What could he want? Rhiannis doesn't know. She's only an ordinary warrior. But she seems to think, Orvig gave a tight smile, that we dwarves control Stonekeep. He wants Jen to tell him our secrets. Orvig turned somber. Poor old Hoth was almost right, boy. The Throgs are preparing for war. Their shaman has big dreams. And now that they've crushed Kel's folk, he wants to drive out our logging parties, and there's a talk of mass assault on the other forts. From what Rhiannis says, I think the shaman plans to conquer the entire Vale of Kera. Maybe more. The shaman in his feathered cloak, Wraith said, recalling Kel's words from just before the magical attack. Who is he? Well, the last chief shaman was an old fellow named Javaka Ray. He'd been shaman for years and years. He believed in trade with the human tribes, the occasional skirmish to keep the young bucks happy, but fighting for honor, not territory. Yes, said Kel, before they tamed the Seymara, Throg traders came 2 or 3 times a year. I remember the strange smells, foreign spices. They brought thick hides from the mountains, and nuggets of raw gold and copper. But sometimes we'd quarrel over hunting grounds, and our warriors would meet the Throgs across a stream. We'd throw spears at each other. When we hit someone, they'd run and give us hunting rights, at least till next season. What if one of your warriors got hurt? Then we'd do the same. Sometimes people got hurt. My Uncle Erge was almost killed. Once in a while they'd raid, steal our sheep, and so would we, but it wasn't war. We never even thought of attacking their villagers, wiping them out. She glared at the captive Throg with hate-filled eyes. Like they did to us. So what happened? Why did Javaka Ray turn hostile? Gothakarn happened. Orvig looked grim. A nasty piece of work. Though our friend Rhiannis doesn't want to tell us much. I think she's almost as frightened of him as she is of Kill. Wraith, do you know how Throgs choose their chieftains? Wraith shook his head. Jen told me once. Through magical duels. Gothakarn... Jen told me once. Through magical duels. Gothakarn had magic, but not much. And if you're the Throg with any magical talent at all, it's not safe to hang around a tribe with a real shaman. You might get the idea that you're trying to replace him and get rid of you first. So you get out of there if you're smart. Find another tribe that doesn't have a shaman, or maybe just live alone and practice your magic. I gather Gothakarn was smart. He went into exile in the wilds, but then he found something. Our captive's just an ordinary hunter warrior. She doesn't know the whole tale. But Karn boasted that while he was exiled, he found a ruined temple in the hills. He defeated its guardian and... He glanced at Cal. And what? Said Cal. And took its head. The black crystal skull, said Wraith. Exactly, said Orvig. It boosted what powers you had already had. It also gave him control over animals. And insects. L followed by R I'm having a hard time with, which sucks with Karkelroth as a place name. We'll see how it goes. Control over animals and insects. The Saymara, said Wraith. The Saymara, echoed Orvig. They were just wild creatures before. That's right, said Cal. They lived in mountains, but they rarely took humans, mostly small game like rabbits and goats. So, it was Gothakarn. She smiled wickedly and stroked the rune-carved tip of her spear. Now her enemy had a name. Have I been out of focus this whole time leaning back? It's fine. Now her... She smiled wickedly and stroked the rune-carved tip of her spear. Now her enemy had a name. And he used the skull's power to craft runes to control them? Orvig nodded. And now that is personal pets, he said. With their help, and whatever other magics I gave him, he came back and defeated the old shaman, Javaka Ray. What happened to Javaka? Wraith asked. Orvig shrugged. Usually the loser is killed in the duel, or right afterward, but Gothakarn kept the old shaman alive. He glanced back at the captive Throg, who was hanging limply in her bonds. Rhiannis doesn't know why, but they're keeping him in a pit in Karkaroth. Just like Jen. If I don't try to pronounce the L, it's okay. Karkaroth. They sat down to eat, sharing the Throg's fruit and bread, smearing it with the last of the cheese. Over Kel's objections, Wraith took their captive a drink of water. Open up, he told her, and tapped his mouth. He mimed drinking. She stared at him for a moment, and Wraith thought he could read in her face a mix of stubborn pride and fear. Then she opened her mouth, and Wraith let her drink from the canteen. Trust not, she told him, in a flat voice. Was it thank you? Or curse? The Wraith shrugged. He went back to join his friends. They were discussing how to get into Karkelroth. Orvig favored scouting the stronghold by daylight while the Throgs slept for hidden entrances. Rhiannis had said that she didn't know of any, but Jen told him that Throg strongholds were riddled with secret passages and hidden portals, bolt holes made by the shaman and his followers. Just because Rhiannis doesn't know about them doesn't mean they're not there, he argued. If everybody knows about them, they're not secret now, are they? And to take for a moment and see who was speaking. So if they're there, said Wraith, how easy would it be to spot them? Oh, that's the hard part, Orvig admitted. If Karkaroth is as big as Rhiannis says it is, it might cover an acre or more. But I like it better than Kel's plan. Wraith looked inquiringly at her. We become Throgs, Kel said. That's why you were looking over their clothes? Wraith asked. She nodded. He frowned and shook his head. It might fool them at a distance in bad, good light, but not up close. We probably smell different too. She's not talking about an ordinary disguise, Orvig said. She's talking about using the rune magic. I don't like it. He looked unhappy. Tell Wraith what you'd have to do, Calandra. I also realized that my dialect, insofar as there was any one Scottish dialect there, started to shift a little bit there. Sounding a little more like something from the Assassin's Creed game I'm playing right now. Anyway, Calandra explained what the rune spell involved. It was simple, but ruthless. Wraith was appalled. But he could think of nothing else. The Throgs they'd killed were already dead, he told himself. Jen wasn't. The rest didn't matter. Over Orvig's objections, he gave Kel his assent. At Wraith's insistence, they dragged the 4 Throg bodies into the bushes so they were out of sight of the captive. He could be ruthless, but letting Rhiannon watch what they were about to do, Wraith knew, was beyond cruelty. Calandra bent over the first Throg corpse. She'd spent the last few minutes sharpening her knife. It's nothing special, Kel said modestly. It's one of the first runes I learned. Every shaman knows it. Washura, the beast mask. Our hunters use it, Kel said, to stalk game. Aye, said Orvig glumly. I've heard traders' tales of it. Your hunters dressed in a cloak cut from an animal skin. A shaman draws a rune, and an illusion covers the hunter, so he looks like the beast whose skin he wears. But the spell is for animals! Yes, said Kel. It was, wasn't it? She smiled, tested the knife's edge on her finger, drew blood. Then she bent to her work. Orvig looked away. Jedha keen, he muttered under his breath. As afternoon faded into evening, 3 Throg warriors gazed at the fastness that was Karkelroth. One was a young male who bore a captured sword of good dwarven make. The second was a female carrying a flint-carved spear, its tip wrapped in rags. The third was very short. Perhaps he'd been stunted at birth or had some Sharga blood. Unusual for Throgs, the eyes of these 3 warriors did not blink in the late afternoon sun. Those eyes looked upon a bleak plateau, broken by jagged outcropping of yellow and brown stone, bare under a brooding sky. The ground was naked save for scraggly bushes and a few hardy rhododendrons, cracked in places, strewn with boulders elsewhere. A dirt track wound its way among them. In the midst squatted a grim fastness, a rude keep built of great blocks of black, unmortared stone. The only entrance was a spiked gate of iron-reinforced timber. The walls were topped with rough battlements. No banner fluttered from its towers, nor did they see warriors manning the defenses. Most of it's underground, said the small Throg, who spoke in the language of Stonekeep but with a dwarven accent. Those works are there just to protect the entrance. Caius, agreed the male warrior, whose name was Wraith. It meant yes in Throg speech. Orvig had drilled them in a few simple Throg phrases in case they were challenged. Caius, the dwarf corrected. The accent's in the last syllable. Leviosa, not Leviosa. I'd sooner kill a Throg than speak with him, said Kel. Try to restrain yourself, Wraith said. I think we should take cover, rest, and then enter an hour or so before dawn. That way most of the Throgs will be tired or getting ready to sleep. Sounds good, boy, said Orvig. Calandra? Caius, said Kel, pronouncing it correctly. She stuck her tongue out at Orvig. It was green. They concealed themselves among boulders and rested, although one of them always kept watch. Earlier, Calandra had spent the morning casting the runes that created the shape-masking cloaks. Wraith and Orvig had sealed the captive Throg in a makeshift prison, a hillside cave with a heavy boulder pushed over the entrance. Over Kel's protests, the trail rations and spare canteens they'd taken from the dead Throgs were left with Rhiannon. They'd last a week, maybe. Wraith hoped he'd be back before then. Wraith couldn't relax. He tugged at the fastening of the skin cloak he wore. It felt constricting, and the smell was a constant reminder of what it was. Yet he dared not remove it. That would break the rune spell. It could only be used once. To replace it would take Kel over an hour. Not to mention another skin. To take his mind off it, he watched the Throg stronghold. By night, Karkelroth was alive with activity. Soon after dark, several parties had left the stronghold, disappearing into the forest. Wraith guessed most were hunters, for they carried long spears but lacked shields or armor. Twice they heard the beating of wings, and once the moonlight glinted off a half-dozen Saimara. They settled on the battlements, like pigeons on a balcony. Ultimately, gaining entrance proved easier than they thought. Wraith spotted 2 sizable hunting parties returning at the same time. It was easier than they'd planned, but he decided to seize the moment. He rousted Orvig and Calandra and broke cover. They moved in behind the hunters, mingling with the stragglers as the 2 parties merged into a single larger group of jostling throgs. Wraith was tense. He knew he was sweating and hoped the spell would conceal it. He chanced to glance at Kel. She moved confidently, like a stalking tigress. Being in the stronghold of her enemy didn't discomfort her. She acted like a throg, snarling at one hunter who stepped too close to her, pushing her way through the mass. He tried to imitate her, to move more confidently without drawing attention to himself. The gate yawned open, and they passed through it. Wraith noted the thickness of the walls, a dozen feet of stone. They entered a timber-roofed corridor that sloped downward. 2 guards stood just inside, wearing armor of boiled leather and bright helmets of beaten copper with their cheeks carved like boar tusks. They carried wooden shields and steel short swords, blades Wraith were sure had been taken from dead Stonekeep traders. No password was asked. The guards merely exchanged guttural greetings with the leaders of the hunting party. Wraith nodded at the guards and was waved through. The passage ended in a series of deep wells. The hunters ahead of Wraith swarmed into and down them, and Wraith saw that wooden ladders led downward. He hesitated, but Orvig tugged at his arm. Deep places held no terror for a dwarf. Kel was already past him. He followed, hand over hand, into the dark. Thankfully it wasn't pitch black. Small lights shone at intervals, tiny sparks that Wraith realized were caged fireflies. The ladder took Wraith into a wide, fire-lit hall. Its walls were of rough-hewn stone, decorated with shields, crossed spears, and animal trophies. A half-dozen side passages led from it, and some of the hunters vanished down them. Throgs, bare to the waist, turned haunches of meat over huge fires. Copper cauldrons bubbled over other fire pits. The air was filled with the odors of Throg cooking, acrid and spicy, but oddly appetizing. A Throg in a leather apron shouted instructions to scurrying figures who Wraith first thought were Throg children. Then he realized they were Shargas, the Throg's stunted cousins. He was blocking traffic. A slim Throg, a young female balancing a sloshing urn on her head, jostled into Wraith and nearly spilled her burden. She stepped back and cringed. He murmured, "Skarl. Sorry." She looked startled, maybe proper warriors didn't apologize, then favored him with an appraising glance and a tusky Throg smile. He caught Kel looking at him oddly, and with a start he realized the Throg girl had, perhaps, found him attractive. Most of the hunters had dumped their kills on wood tables or hung them from hooks in the ceiling, then left. Wraith knew he had to keep moving. He looked to Orvig, and the dwarf nodded. Soon they picked a little-trod passage at random and took it. Soon, Wraith lost all sense of direction. Corridors branched away like fingers from a hand, multiplying into a bewildering labyrinth. "Rhiannis said this place has at least 3 levels," said Orvig. "The pits are at the bottom. Look for any ladders or stairs." The passage they were traveling was narrow, pierced with crude doorways covered with hanging blankets. From behind some came voices, and once what sounded like a blow followed by a yelp. He hesitated beside it. Could it be Jen? When it flew open, and a pair of tiny Throg children, naked save for sandals, ran out, holding loaves of bread. They ducked around Wraith and ran down the corridor. A moment later, an elderly Throg stuck his head out of the doorway and shook his fist, then noticed Wraith and Kel, paused, muttered "Skarl," and backed away. Wraith grinned sheepishly. They continued on their way. "Gods, what a maze," Kel said. She shuddered. They'd been walking for some minutes. As they went deeper into Karkelroth, the firefly cages became fewer in number, the dark grew more oppressive. "Are the dwarves' caverns like this?" "Somewhat," answered Wraith, "but they're lit by silver lamps and decorated by hanging tapestries, not like this gloom." "Still, this is good stonework," Orvig remarked, being entirely stereotypical as far as dwarves and stonework goes. He tapped the close-fitting blocks making up the wall. He was interrupted by shouts and the sound of many boots, and suddenly the passage was filled with jostling, pushing Throgs. The living wave carried Wraith down the corridor, into a side chamber filled with tables and benches, its walls decorated with hunting trophies and crossed spears. The warriors elbowed each other, calling out names and snatches of songs. Most bore drinking horns filled with foaming liquid. "Unimekaraske!" a Throg yelled. There was an answering shout, and a dozen horns were raised in toast. In the crush, Wraith had lost sight of Orvig. He thought he saw Kel, but it was hard to be sure among so many green, leather-clad bodies. He tried to move in that direction. A bulky warrior in a copper helmet like those the gate guards had worn was beside Wraith. He raised his drink and yelled, "Ista Gothaske!" Several heads turned, but none answered him, and Wraith felt a tension in the room. Had that been a toast to Gotha Karn? The copper-helmed warrior lurched to his feet and glared around him. His eyes came to rest on Wraith beside him. He shoved a drinking horn into Wraith's hand, then splashed liquid into it from a flask. "Istak ye Gotha!" he snarled, one fist raised threateningly. No need for trouble. Wraith lifted the horn and shouted, "Gothaske!" hoping it made sense. The toast was echoed by the copper-helmed warrior, and by a few others as well, though not by all. Experimentally, Wraith downed the brew. He nearly choked. It was steaming hot. The copper-helmed warrior laughed and clapped him on the arm, pushing past to sit by him, ignoring what looked like glares from those around him. A second copper-helmeted Throg pushed through the crowd and joined him at the table. They conversed in low tones. Wraith tried to listen, but he could understand little Throg speak. He caught one or two words. Samara was one, Gotha another, but no meaning. Wraith pretended to sip his drink and looked about, seeking his companions in the press of bodies. There was still no sign of Orvig, but from somewhere behind him he heard what sounded like Kalandra's voice, raised in urgent tones. He whirled about, spotted her. "Hey! Hey!" she was saying. Throg speak for no. A tall Throg had grabbed hold of her, was trying to plant wet kisses on her face. Kel was struggling, breathing hard. The Throg reached for Kel's cloak to tear it away. That would break the rune spell! Without thinking, Wraith stepped forward, grabbed the over-amorous Throg by the collar and yanked him back. The warrior fell heavily against the floor with a crash, his drinking horn splashing Wraith with hot brew. The Throg shook his head, stunned, and stared up dumbly. A dozen heads turned. Trouble. "Matar!" shouted Wraith, exhausting his store of Throg speech. "Mine." He drew Kel roughly into his arms and kissed her full on the mouth, then took a swig of his drink. "Matar!" he repeated. He hoped he looked and sounded like a drunken, jealous lover. Kel helped, wrapping her arms tightly around him. She snarled down at the Throg on the floor, then grinned up at Wraith. It worked. There was laughter, not threats, and the heads turned away. The copper-helmed Throg who'd given Wraith the drink slapped him on the back. Two others helped the downed Throg to his feet, then passed him a fresh drink. Holding Kel tightly, it was strange to feel her lithe shape under the Throg disguise, Wraith shouldered his way to the edge of the crowd. They found Orvig waiting just outside the chamber, tapping his foot. He looked none the worse for wear. He noticed Wraith's drink-splashed tunic, Kalandra's disarrayed clothes, and raised an eyebrow. "Didn't stay for the party?" said Wraith lightly. He was still breathing hard. It had been close. Kel pressed his hand and smiled at him, then stepped back and smoothed her clothes back into shape. Wraith looked right, then left. They were in a narrow hallway lined with doorways. "Come on, let's go," Wraith said. They came to a bend, heard more shouts and noise coming along one passage, took the other. It seemed to slant downward. They followed it for several minutes. Twice they saw single Throgs run by, stripped to loincloths and wearing coarse yellow scarves around their necks. "Are they messengers?" he asked Orvig. The dwarf shrugged. He didn't know. The trio took a side passage. Ahead they heard the hiss of fabric on stone, grunting voices cursing. It was a trio of skinny Throgs in ragged clothes, dragging heavy sacks. Before Wraith could pull him back, Orvig stepped in front of them. The Throg workers stopped, looking nervously at each other. "Hroi Makar Brota!" Orvig hailed them. "Good night, kinsman." Good night, kinsman," Wraith knew that was. Orvig slurred his words as if drunk to cover any deficiencies in his accent. "Yitesreik po podor?" Wraith wasn't sure what the rest meant, only that it was a question. One of them scratched his head. "Skarl," he said. "Ye podor mistrek." He waved down a side passage. "Ye podor rukasnu." "Kayas," said Orvig. He gestured at Wraith to follow, and he and Kel did so. The Throg stepped aside to let them pass. They turned right, and Wraith could feel a faint draft. They found themselves in a small chamber with a stairway leading down. "You asked directions?" Kel asked the dwarf. "Aye," Orvig said. He gestured. "The pits are down this way, past the storeroom." He frowned. "I seemed edgy." Maybe they thought you were drunk and mean, Kel said. She looked down at him, patting his head. A pint-sized warrior like you's got to be twice as nasty, right? Orvig glanced at her. Orvig gave her an irritated glare. It was more than that, he told her. Perhaps no one likes to talk about the dungeons. They followed the stairwell down. It led down a long way, past a landing, and then into a small chamber with 3 passages branching out of it. A well stood in the middle, a bucket beside it. Orvig sniffed the water. It should be safe, he said, and he took a short drink. The others followed suit. Which way? Asked Wraith. He said the left passage, Orvig answered. He led them down it. The stonework here seemed rougher, more natural. The passage was dark and poorly lit, and they were taken by surprise when it suddenly widened into a cavernous chamber filled with wooden barrels. Wraith banged into one of them. It sloshed slightly. They looked about, found a wooden doorway. A faint light showed under it. The dungeons? Said Kel. It's in the right place, Orvig answered. Careful, warned Wraith. There may be guards we can't talk our way past. Orvig put his ear to the door, listened, then motioned Wraith over and unfastened his pack. As Wraith and Kel watched, the dwarf carefully looked through the many bottles and implements there. After what seemed like hours, his stubby fingers seized a small vial. He uncorked it and dripped a thick liquid onto the door's hinges. Oil, Orvig said, so it won't squeak. Open it just a crack. Wraith did, slowly and carefully, a hairline crack. The door opened noiselessly. He peered through. The chamber was... Hold on. So, like, Calandra had the wicker thing with the bird in it, and now he's just got what, you know, it's, oh, let me dig through all this and find oil. Basically, they have video game character inventories. Which is entirely appropriate. The chamber was squarish, about 10 paces on a side, lit by the glow of a shielded brazier filled with hot coals. There was a closed wooden door at the far end. Beside it stood a slim, youthful throg dressed in close-fitting brown leather. He wore a dark cowl over his head, his ears protruding from it. He was speaking with one of the copper-helmeted warriors that Wraith was beginning to think of as Gotha's guards. The warrior was gesturing at the floor, pointing at a trapdoor, one of 5 evenly spaced around the room. Wraith couldn't make out his words, though. He moved his head slightly, trying to take in the entire room through the narrow crack. 2 other copper-helmed guards were seated around a low table, ignoring the conversation. They were scratching designs into the tabletop. They were scratching designs into the tabletop with knives, concentrating on them. A pitcher of water and a half-eaten loaf of bread sat on the table beside them, and after a moment Wraith guessed they were playing some kind of game. Behind the guard's table was a cross-shaped wooden frame, its sides pitted and stained. Beside it, Wraith saw a long coil of coarse rope, a bucket, and a many-thonged whip. He shuddered, guessing at their purpose. Kel was interested. No, it doesn't say that. He felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Calandra. He pulled back, letting Kel and Orvig take their own turns. Orvig stayed for a long while. After a moment, Wraith saw his friend's shoulders were shaking. They moved back from the door and took cover behind a barrel. What is it? Wraith asked. Did you hear what they were saying? Curse them, said Orvig. He turned to Wraith, eyes burning. The cowled throg came from Gothakarn. The shaman is impatient. The prisoner's rations are halved. Again. Orvig stressed the last word. The guard told them they'd already halved them once. If they fed them any less, they'd eat each other. Orvig slammed his fist into his palm. Then they both laughed. We'll get her out, Wraith said. Don't worry. Wraith and Orvig conferred in low voices. In the end, they could come up with nothing more clever than a frontal attack. They would try to freeze the guards with a shout, kill them all, and take their clothing. Dragon shout. Okay. 1995. 15 years before Skyrim? I don't know. They would try to freeze the guards with a shout, kill them all, and take their clothing. With luck, the copper helms would be symbols of authority that would let them get outside. As they spoke, Kel remained silent, simply nodding in agreement. Wraith wondered what she was thinking. He remembered the feel of her against him when they'd kissed. He took Kel's hand. She looked up. Be careful, he told her. Kel smiled, nodded. You too. She grinned. Don't worry. I'm the Jedi King. Orvig and Wraith drew their blades, and Kel unwrapped the rags that covered the runes on her spear's tip. "Ready?" said Orvig. Wraith nodded. "Now!" Orvig kicked the door open and charged, shouting, "Jen!" The other two followed on his heels, yelling wordlessly, maniacally. The companions were across the room before the Throgs could draw their weapons. But though the guards were surprised, they were good. One of them shouted and kicked the table over at Calandra. It overturned, sending the pitcher of water shattering on the stone floor. Kel jumped back, and then the Throg had his own sword out. Orvig and the other guard were locked in a duel of flashing blades. The Throg had the edge on reach, but Orvig seemed filled with a demonic energy. The Throg shouted loudly and attacked. Orvig parried the stroke, feinted at the Throg's head, then slashed at his wrist. He cut too low, and the blade sliced away 2 fingers instead. Dark blood spurted. Kel thrust with her spear, holding it two-handed. Her foe parried and fell back. Kel stepped over the fallen table, advancing cautiously. She knew she had the reach on him. Wraith faced 2 Throgs, but the cowled youth seemed armed with only a knife. The guard with him had been looking the other way when they'd burst in. He whirled, eyes widening at the sight of Wraith's charge. Perhaps he would have drawn his sword in time, but then the cowled Throg yelled and shoved his companion, impaling him on Wraith's sword. They went down in a tumble of limbs. The cowled Throg turned and ran for the door. The warrior facing Orvig dropped his sword, clutching his ruined hand. Orvig followed through with a hard upthrust into the stomach. The Throg went down, clutching at his belly. Wraith gasped for breath. The warrior atop him was a dead weight, unmoving. He looked up and saw the other door squeak closed. The cowled Throg was getting away. He cursed feelingly, shoved the body away, and struggled to his feet, trying to tug his blade free of his foe's ribs. Kel's foe looked wildly about and saw both his friends were down. His ears flattened and he charged with a berserk yell. Kel braced herself and spitted him neatly through the breast, her rune-tipped spear piercing the boiled leather armor with ease. Orvig stood panting, holding his bloody sword. "Jen!" He grabbed the coil of rope, then examined the trapdoors in the floor. 4 were unbolted. The 5th was locked shut. He slid the bolt open and looked down. The pit was 7 feet deep and stank. A small niche halfway up held an oil lamp. Its pitiless light illuminated 2 faces staring hopelessly upward. The only furnishing was a reeking slop bucket. Wraith ran to the door and opened it. It led into a long corridor. 20 paces down its length, he saw the black-cowled Throg. And he wasn't alone. A half-dozen warriors surrounded him. He pointed at Wraith and shouted something. Wraith could guess what it was. Orvig looked down into the pit. One prisoner was a Throg, his green face pale and wrinkled with great age, his body thin and frail. Had he been a human, he might have been 70 or 80. As it was, Orvig couldn't guess his age. His eyes were... With a start, Orvig realized he was blind. The eyes were empty sockets, surrounded by charred flesh. The second... Orvig's heart leapt. It was Jen. Her youthful face was dirty and tear-streaked, eyes red with lack of sleep. Her clothes were rags, but it was his sister. It was Jen. She looked up, squinting, then shrank back, as if afraid. "Jen!" Orvig shouted. The girl paused, startled to hear her name. What have they done to her? Orvig thought. She doesn't know me. He slapped his forehead, then tore off the rune cloak. "Jen, it's me!" The dwarf girl put her hand to her mouth. "Orvig?" she said wonderingly. She rubbed her eyes. "It is you!" "Jen!" he called. "I've come to get you!" He lowered down the rope. "Catch!" "Orvig!" she shouted. Then she turned to her cellmate, who had watched Orvig with his sightless eyes. "Please, you have to help him too! Please, you have to help him too!" Stressing the correct syllables in the sentence. She tied the rope around the Throg's waist. Wraith ducked back into the room. "You found her?" Orvig only grunted. He and Kel tied the rope around the table, and Orvig was straining against the rope, pulling. A head popped into view. It wasn't Jen. It was an old Throg. Wraith stared. Was this Javaka Ray, the ancient shaman? There was no time to waste. "Kel, help me! Bring the table to brace the door. We can build a barricade and..." The table is being used to bring people up the rope. You can't repurpose it like that when people are climbing the... Come on, guy. He heard running footsteps. Stuck his head out the door. A half-dozen warriors were charging up the corridor. "Gods, there's no time!" He glanced back at Orvig. He was straining at the rope again, the old Throg helping him. At least he was good for something, Wraith thought. "Hurry!" It's a surprise that with all that going on, the warriors weren't in already. They apparently just stayed at the end of the hallway for a while, waiting for plot permission to come and attack. Wraith drew his sword, prepared to meet them just inside the doorway. Kel moved to stand by his side. 8 Throgs charged. They had shields and light armor. Wraith could see the cowled youth behind them, urging them on. Suddenly, Kel cast off her cloak. Wraith did the same. The onrushing Throgs halted in disarray, suddenly faced by the apparition of 2 human warriors. Wraith shouted and charged, Kel right behind him. Caught by surprise, the two Throgs fell in as many seconds. Wraith grabbed a fallen shield. Wraith shouted, "Orvig!" Wraith shouted, period, "Orvig," no ending punctuation, end quotation mark, he shouted. Wraith shouted, Orvig, he shouted. Wraith shouted, "Orvig, take Jen and run!" He parried a blow, ducked, and thrust. "Hurry! If you get out, meet at the cave!" Orvig gave a final heave. His sister popped out of the well and into his arms. She stood beside him, hugging him. He heard Wraith's shout over the clash of blades. "No time for that," he said. He paused, his hand on his sword. Wraith needed him. He felt a hand on his arm. It was the old shaman. "Your friends are warriors," he said, voice a harsh whisper. Words strangely accented but understandable. "You cannot help them now. Your sister needs you. She will not escape without you. You came down the stairway?" "Aye," said Orvig. "We'll try to reach it." "We must make for it. The landing there—" "I know, damn you!" Orvig shouted. He hesitated briefly, then looked at the door. Cursing, weeping, he led Jen and ran from the room into the warehouse. The shaman stumbled behind. Wraith fought on, though the corridor ahead was alive with Throgs. He thrust and parried, his sword arm leaden, his shield arm numb. The buckler he'd grabbed was hacked nearly to bits, but it had done its work well. He had yet to take a wound. Kel had been less lucky. Blood dripped from a long, shallow cut along her thigh, and Wraith could tell she was slowing. He glanced sideways at her. Her spear darted like a snake's tongue, stabbing in and out. Though she had no shield, she turned blows deftly, using her spear as though it were a quarterstaff to block sword and axe blows. Together they gave ground slowly, making the Throgs pay for every foot. But even so, they'd been forced back into the doorway of the dungeon chamber. At least Orvig got away, Wraith told himself, and Jen. They still have a chance. Orvig kept urging Jen to move faster. His sister was falling behind, slowing herself to help the blind old Throg. Every so often he stopped, listening. He still thought he could hear shouts, the clash of arms. Against hope, he prayed Wraith and Kel would make it, that something, Wraith's skill, Kel's magic, would be enough to make a difference, that they would get away. There was no rest for Wraith. Reinforcements had come, but for the wrong side. The first Throg warriors had fled or fallen, replaced by copper-helmeted elite guards, armed with shields and steel swords. The last minute of fighting had claimed few casualties. They'd wounded some more Throgs, but had been unable to press their own attacks. The warriors they faced were more skilled, and injured guards had simply fallen back, allowing fresh warriors to take their places. He and Kel had no such respite. They'd been forced back into the chamber, and now stood back to back, surrounded. There was no place to retreat, no place to run. Through the circle of warriors, Wraith glimpsed the visage of the cowled, youthful Throg, the one who had killed one of his own warriors to escape Wraith. Now his pale green face was smiling, his cold eyes gazing at Wraith and Kel as if he already possessed them. Then he turned away, shouting orders in a calm voice, calling more soldiers into the fray. Kel saw him too. Hate boiled within her, mingling with the pain of her wound. She wished she dared to cast her spear. He was obviously a leader of some sort. But then she would fall, and there would be no one to guard Wraith's back. They reached the stairs, pounding upward. The old Throg had his hand pressed to his side, and seemed to be in pain. "Brother," Jen panted, are there many more stairs?" Orvig nodded. "But there's a landing coming up," he added. "We'll rest there in a moment." He could hear no sounds of pursuit. Not yet, anyway. He pushed that thought away. Pursuit would mean that Wraith... Now Wraith stood alone. Kel lay on the ground, a broken spear protruding from her shoulder. Blood pooled beneath her. Unconscious or dead, Wraith couldn't tell. "Alive!" hissed the cowled leader. "Take him alive!" Wraith couldn't understand the words, but he guessed the meaning. A wave of new Throgs came, armed with shields and clubs. Wraith raised his sword. The foe broke over him like a green tide. Zhen's own breath came in great gasps. Confined for nearly a week, she was in poor shape to run, but they dared not stop. They reached the landing. Zhen collapsed on the floor. The old Throg dropped to his knees, hugging himself, then dragged himself to his feet. Orvig leaned against the wall. But they couldn't rest. They could hear the pursuit now, shouts coming from below. He turned to Zhen, shook her shoulder. No more lying to myself, he thought. We won't make it. It's internal dialogue, will still. No more lying to myself, he thought. We won't make it. He drew his sword. A withered, pale green hand fell on his shoulder. Blind eyes turned to meet his own. Wait, Zhen's brother, said the old voice. I have a better way. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Comment below. There is one chapter left, plus the epilogue, but the epilogue is like a page, so we're going to do that in the same video as Chapter 7. So be sure to... I just realized my backlight wasn't on either, but whatever. So yes, give this video a thumb up if you liked it, comment down below, and follow to see the final chapter of Thera Awakening, and then playing Stonekeep right afterward. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.com/BoaterBug, support me at Patreon and Ko-Fi.com/BoaterBug, and watch live at Twitch.tv/BoaterBug. Thank you all so much for watching, have a good one, and I will see you next time as we finish Thera Awakening. Bye everybody!